Today's story will take us to the year 945 AD, and it will take us to modern-day Kiev. Back then, we will follow the story of a young lady who became a princess, a wife, and then a widow. In English, a widow is a woman whose husband died. But for this woman called Olga, Princess Olga, her husband didn't die in a natural way, and he didn't even die a hero in the battlefield. He actually died because of a rebellion. He was killed by rebellious people. When we talk about rebellion, we mean that's when people fight back against a government's decision. So there was a decision taken by this prince, this king, and people fought back, and the prince or the king was killed cruelly. What will Olga decide to do? This is what we will discover in today's story. But before we go there and start the first chapter, there is a little disclaimer. Today's story needs to be taken with a little grain of salt. In English, when you take a piece of information with a grain of salt, that means that you don't believe the story 100%, because this is a story that was told in historical chronicles. So we don't know, and also historians don't know, if all the events told in the story were actually 100% real. But the story itself has a very important message, a very important moral story that I would love for you to tell me in the comments by the end of the video. Before we go, let me kindly remind you that you are watching WooEnglish, the channel that teaches you English not through boring vocabulary lessons or grammar videos, but through stories taken from varied topics. We covered varied topics and themes. You can find in our channel videos about science, technology, history, politics, and so on and so forth. A lot of topics, and also whatever your level is, you will definitely find a video that caters just for that level. Without further ado, let's jump into the story and see how the story of Olga begins.
Chapter 1. The Death of Igor. The year was 945 AD. In the city of Kyiv, Prince Igor ruled over a large land. Igor had power, soldiers, and many people under his control. But ruling such a large area was not easy. Different groups lived across the land. They had their own leaders and their own ways of life. Still, many of them had to pay Igor every year. One of these groups was called the Drevlians. Every year, Igor and his men traveled through their land to collect money and goods. At first, everything went as usual. The Drevlians gave Igor what he asked for, and the prince began his journey back to Kyiv. But on the way home, Igor changed his mind. He wanted more. So he sent most of his soldiers ahead and returned to the Drevlians with only a small group of men. This time, he asked them to pay again. The Drevlians were shocked. They had already given him what he wanted. Why had he returned? Their anger grew. For them, this was too much. Their leader gathered his men. He warned them that if they continued to give Igor more and more, one day they would have nothing left. So they made a decision. They would not pay again. And Igor had made one serious mistake. Most of his army was no longer with him. The Drevlians attacked. Igor and the small group of men around him had little chance to escape. The prince was captured. And then he was killed. According to an old historical story, his death was especially cruel. The Drevlians tied him to 2 trees that had been pulled down toward the ground. Then they released the trees. Igor died there, far from his palace and far from his family. Back in Kiev, Olga was waiting for her husband. But Igor would never return. Soon, the news reached the palace. Her husband was dead. Olga was now alone with their young son, Sviatoslav, who was still too young to rule. The Drevlians believed the problem was finished. Igor was dead. His son was only a child. And Olga was only his wife. They thought they were now in a strong position. In fact, they believed they could turn Igor's death into an opportunity. So they prepared a message for Olga. It was not an apology. It was not an offer of peace. They wanted something much more surprising. They wanted Olga to marry their prince. And soon, a group of Drevlians began the journey to Kiev to give her the proposal in person. They had no idea who was waiting for them. Chapter 2: The Marriage Proposal. The Drevlians arrived in Kiev with confidence. They believed Olga was in a weak position. Her husband was dead. Her son was still a child. And the men who had killed Igor now thought they could control what happened next. They came with a simple message. Their prince wanted to marry Olga. If she accepted, the Drevlians believed they could join her land to their own power. For them, it seemed like a clever plan. But when the messengers stood before Olga, they did not know what she was thinking. Olga listened quietly. She did not shout. She did not accuse them of killing her husband. She did not order her guards to arrest them. Instead, she surprised them. She told the men that she liked their proposal. The messengers must have felt relieved. Perhaps they believed everything was going exactly as planned. Then Olga made a strange request. She told them to return to their boat and wait there. The next morning, she said, her people would come to them. But the Drevlians should not walk into the city. They should stay inside their boat. Olga promised that the people of Kyiv would carry them to the palace. It would be a sign of respect. The messengers liked the idea. They had come to Kyiv expecting to be treated as important men. Now Olga herself seemed ready to honor them. So they returned to their boat. But Olga had not accepted their proposal. She had already made a different decision. That night, she gave an order. Her servants went into the palace yard and began to dig. They dug a deep hole. The Drevlians knew nothing about it. The next morning, Olga sent men to the river. The messengers were still sitting inside their boat, just as she had told them. Olga's men lifted the boat. The Drevlians sat proudly inside as they were carried through Kyiv. To them, it probably looked like a victory. People were carrying them toward the palace. They believed Olga was ready to become the wife of their prince. But the journey did not end where they expected. The men carried the boat into the palace yard. Then they stopped beside the deep hole. Only then did the Drevlians understand. But it was too late. The boat was thrown into the hole with all the men still inside. According to the old story, Olga looked down at them. The men who had arrived in Kyiv so confidently were now trapped. They had believed Olga was powerless. Now they understood their mistake. But Olga was not finished. The Drevlians back home still did not know what had happened to their messengers. They were waiting for good news. Olga decided to use that. She sent them a message. If they truly wanted her to marry their prince, she said, they should send their most important men to Kiev. Only then would she agree to go with them. The Drevlians accepted. They chose some of their best and most respected men, and they sent them directly to Olga. The first messengers had disappeared. Now a second group was coming, and this time, Olga had prepared something different. Chapter 3: The Second Revenge. The second group of Drevlians traveled to Kiev with no fear. They believed Olga was ready to accept the marriage. They also believed the first messengers had done their job well. They did not know that those men were already dead. When the new group arrived, Olga welcomed them calmly. These were not ordinary messengers. They were important men, leaders, men respected by their people, exactly the kind of men Olga had asked for. She told them they should rest after their long journey. Before meeting her, she said they could wash and prepare themselves. A warm bath was ready for them. The Drevlians saw nothing strange in this. They had traveled a long distance. They were tired, and they believed they were being treated as honored guests. So they entered the bathhouse. Then Olga's men closed the doors. The Drevlians were trapped inside. A moment later, the building was set on fire. The men tried to escape, but there was no way out. According to the old story, none of them survived. Olga had now killed 2 groups sent by the Drevlians, but the people back home still did not understand what was happening, and Olga used their lack of knowledge again. She sent another message. This time, she said she was ready to travel to the place where Igor had died. Before marrying their prince, she wanted to hold a great meal in memory of her husband. She asked the Drevlians to prepare food and drink. They agreed. To them, this sounded reasonable. Igor was dead. Olga was going to honor him. Then they believed she would finally accept her new future. So they prepared for her arrival. Olga traveled to their land with her own people. When she arrived, she went to the place connected to Igor's death. There, a large meal was prepared. Many Drevlians came. They ate, they drank, and as the hours passed, they became less careful. Olga's men continued to serve them more drink. The Drevlians believed the conflict was over. Olga seemed calm. There was no army attacking them, no open threat, no reason to be afraid. But Olga had not come only to remember her husband. She had come with another plan. She waited. The Drevlians kept drinking. Soon, many of them could hardly stand. That was the moment Olga had been waiting for. She gave a signal. Her men drew their weapons. The celebration changed in seconds. According to the old account, many Drevlians were killed that day. The people who had believed Olga was coming in peace now understood the truth. This was no longer only about a marriage proposal. This was revenge. But even after all this, Olga still wanted more. She had punished messengers. She had punished leaders. She had punished men at the feast. Now she turned her attention to something much bigger. The city itself. And this time, Olga would not arrive as a grieving wife. She would arrive with an army. Chapter 4. The Siege. Olga returned with an army.
So in the first part of this video, we followed the story of Olga and how she went from being a princess in a castle to a widow, grieving the death of her husband. Her husband who didn't pass away in a natural way, but rather he was killed in a very cruel way during a rebellion. So Olga is not the same anymore. She is saddened, she is grieving, and this grief changed her. Alongside the beginning of the story of Olga, we also discovered a few vocabulary items, a few words that probably for some of you, they are new words. Maybe for others, you are discovering new expressions, new words from this story. Some words that we have seen through the first few chapters are words like widow, throne, grief, and so on and so forth. So let's go and see how the story will develop, and also we'll discover new vocabulary that will be used in the following chapters.
This time, there was no secret meeting, no marriage proposal, no celebration. The Drevlians knew she was coming, and now they knew exactly what she wanted: war. Olga's army moved into their land. The Drevlians tried to defend themselves, but Olga's forces were stronger. Village after village fell under her control. But one place was different. Their main city refused to give up. The people closed the gates and prepared for a long fight. Olga's army surrounded the city. Days passed, then weeks, but the city remained strong. The people inside knew what Olga had done before. They had heard about the messengers. They had heard about the bathhouse. They had heard about the feast. They knew that giving up could mean death. So they continued to fight. Olga waited. Her soldiers could attack the walls, but taking the city would cost many lives. She needed another way. Time passed, and the people inside began to suffer. Food became harder to find. People were tired. They were afraid, but they still refused to open the gates. Then Olga sent them a message. The people expected another threat. Instead, her words surprised them. She told them that she did not want a large payment. She said the other towns had already accepted her rule. Why should this city continue to suffer? Olga offered them a way to end the war, and her request seemed almost too easy. She did not ask for gold. She did not ask for silver. She did not ask them to give her their homes. She asked for something small. From every house, she wanted a few birds, pigeons and sparrows. The people inside the city were confused. Birds? After such a long war, this was all she wanted? It sounded strange, but it also sounded safe. Everyone had birds near their homes. Giving Olga a few of them seemed like a very small price for peace. The people began to believe that perhaps the worst was finally over. They collected the birds. Then they sent them to Olga. The gates did not need to open. No soldiers entered the city. No one was attacked. For the first time in a long time, the people felt hope. Perhaps Olga had finally decided to stop. Perhaps the war was finished. But outside the city walls, Olga's soldiers were preparing something. They were not preparing to eat the birds. They were not preparing to release them. Each bird was given something small to carry. And when night came, Olga gave one final order. The birds were released. They flew into the dark sky. And every one of them knew exactly where to go. Home. Chapter 5. The Final Plan. The birds flew back toward the city. To the people inside, they looked harmless. They were simply coming home. But each bird carried something small. A piece of burning material had been tied to its body. The birds returned to the places they knew best: roofs, barns, small buildings, places where they had lived before the war. And then the fires began. At first, there were only a few. Then more appeared. One roof caught fire, then another. Soon, flames were rising in many parts of the city at the same time. The people tried to stop them, but there were too many fires. And because the flames had started in different places, no one knew where to go first. Fear spread quickly. People ran through the streets. Families left their homes. Some tried to carry water. Others simply tried to escape. The city that had resisted Olga's army for so long was now burning from inside. And outside the walls, Olga was waiting. The people had believed the birds were the price of peace. Instead, according to the old story, they had helped Olga enter the city without opening a single gate. As the fire grew, people began to escape through the city gates. Olga's soldiers were ready. The city finally fell. For the Drevlians, the war was over. They had killed Igor because they believed he had asked too much from them. Then they had looked at his wife and seen someone weak. That mistake had changed everything. Olga had lost her husband, but she had not lost control. She had answered the first messengers. Then the second group. Then the men at the feast. And finally, the city itself. Her revenge was complete. But this was not the end of Olga's story. In fact, what happened later may be even more surprising. Years passed. Olga continued to rule while her son was still young. She traveled. She met powerful rulers. And then she made a decision that few people would expect from the woman remembered for such a violent revenge. Olga became a Christian. Later, the Christian church would remember her not as a cruel enemy, but as a saint. The woman whose name became famous because of revenge would also become famous because of faith. And this leaves us with one final question. How much of this incredible story really happened? Olga was a real person. Igor was real. The conflict with the Drevlians was real. But the most dramatic parts of her revenge come from an old account written many years later. So perhaps every detail happened exactly as the story says. Or perhaps history and legend became mixed together over time. We may never know. But one thing is clear. The men who thought Olga was powerless helped create one of the most unforgettable stories of the medieval world.
And with this, we come to the end of the story. Today's story was a historical one, a tale about a princess who lost her husband, who was grieving because her husband went away or passed away in a very cruel way. She decided to take revenge, to avenge her husband, her late husband. When we say late plus person, that means a person who died recently or died before the information mentioned. Throughout the story, we saw how Olga planned a very clever way to take revenge against the people who took the life of her husband. And today's story asks a very important question. Is love enough to take revenge against people? Was she in the right place, or was she wrong to take revenge against the people rebelling against her husband? Alongside the story of Olga, we also went through a variety of vocabulary that were very good, suitable for intermediates, but I think also people who are watching this channel, who are watching this video, who are probably beginners or even advanced, may definitely have benefited from the story in one way or another. Maybe the information, maybe new expressions, maybe even new word. If you have just learned new word through today's story, we are very happy. We think that we achieved our goal through this story. Thank you so much for watching. Before you go, let me kindly ask you again to subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. I hope you are convinced to do so now. And if you haven't liked the video, please do that to support this channel. Leave us a comment answering today's question, or even giving us your opinion about today's story. And of course, this is very important. If you would love to get your hands to have the PDF version of today's story, of Olga's story, you can do that on our website, WooEnglish.com. Or if you would love to join our brilliant, thriving WooEnglish communities, either on Telegram or on WhatsApp, you can do that through the links that we leave under every single video. Thank you so much for watching. Maybe go and check our other videos, or maybe wait for our future videos. Thank you. See you in the next videos.